Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Rocket Sled Studios podcast. My name is Andy Schmidt. I'm here with Cristóbal Krusen. We're going to be having a conversation about film, story, movies, the impact of story on societies and internationally and locally. So we're going to talk about a lot of different things, and I'm excited to do this. Before we get into it, Chris, do you just want to tell people a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Well, yes, I'm a filmmaker. I'm a writer and an actor. And I was born in Tampa, Florida, grew up there. And in my mid-teens and later teens, went to a boarding school. I was 15 when I went away for the first time, saw snow for the first time up north, and then went on to college up north and ended up living in New York City for 13 years. After I graduated from NYU Film School, I stayed in New York City and sought my entree into the film industry there in New York. And yeah, it's been a long road since.
Well, you mentioned before we were recording, you mentioned that you grew up in a stable home. It was a good family, but not a Christian family. But now you're a Christian.
Yeah.
So maybe tell us a little bit about how you became a Christian.
Yeah. Well, that is a long story. We could use the entire hour talking about that. But I gave my life to Christ at the age of 29. So that, by inference, would indicate that I had lived a different life. You know, I can identify with Paul the Apostle, who called himself the chief of sinners.
Yeah, right.
I saw no relevance to my life I saw no relevance in Christianity for my life. In fact, I was on a search, and this is important to understand my story. I was honestly, sincerely, truly searching for truth, for meaning beyond the material, observable world that we all experience if we have sight, you know, and as human beings, we all experience that. But the question I had is there something more? Is there something beyond just the physical? And of course, that's a question that millions and millions of people ask and have asked through the centuries. Yeah. And so I was not unusual in that regard. Where I began looking for meaning was in Eastern religions. Before that, I was looking into the occult, metaphysics, and I was willing to read, study, talk to anyone who had any orientation toward those things to see what I might glean from them. However, I was really not too interested in talking to Christians. I didn't know any Christians, and I frankly assumed that Christianity was a refuge for hypocrites. My experience was that the church was kind of an extended social club sort of thing, and there was no real application of the Christian principles that you might even hear in the church on a Sunday to life beyond the church. Sure. So, and then I saw racism in the church as well, and that deeply bothered me. The sinners were not racist, by and large, the ones I knew. And yet I discovered that the people who were racist often, not always, but often were very, they were professing Christians. And the context for that statement is that I was in a relationship with a black woman, an African-American woman, who became my wife. And I never experienced racism from black people. I mean, sometimes there'd be a look, because I'm a white person in the black community. More often than not, it was on the other side, white people discriminating against me and my girlfriend, who eventually became my wife. And that deeply bothered me. And, maybe there's a cautionary tale in that for Christians in general, is that the world is watching. And I was watching. Now, how did I become a Christian then?
Well, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, sure.
Because you're saying you went to Eastern religions and the occult, and then you mentioned metaphysics. Were you searching for a spirituality, or were you searching? Because metaphysics is like a science in some capacity, and it is even maybe a deeper realm of materialism rather than a spiritual experience that you would find in Eastern religion or in the occult. So, was it generally just I'm looking for something more, or were you going down like I'm okay with the materialistic worldview, but I kind of want the metaphysics to explain some of the spiritual things, or what exactly were you? I know that's a wide-ranging question, but what were you like looking for specifically? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you see, I could have called myself a nihilist, perhaps, or an existentialist. Okay. Not quite an anarchist, but I'm living there in New York City in the 1970s, in my 20s. Part of those early 20s, I was still studying, but after I graduated, like I said earlier, I still lived in Manhattan, was living in New York, and I had become very disillusioned with life. I wasn't a humanist. Maybe that's an important point to make. I kind of dismissed humanism too, because I thought to myself, okay, wait a minute. You're an agnostic. Maybe you're an atheist. So life to you has no ultimate purpose. Well, how is it that if that's the case, you're able to get up in the morning and put a necktie around your neck without hanging yourself? You know, you put on the necktie to go to work. Yeah. Some 9-to-5 job, and you want to advance and get promoted and become the head of the company, become rich and famous, and there's no purpose in it. There's no ultimate meaning to that. Right. So to me, that was, sorry to say, I guess that was hypocritical as well.
It didn't function like the philosophy stated. You know, philosophy states nothing matters. It's like, well, you're living like something matters. So you're living
like something matters. Yeah, right. And to me, that was, you know, little children observe everything, right? Yeah. And they can tell. They, I heard the story once about a child who heard this preacher and said later to his mother, I don't know if it was a girl or boy, said, why is that man so angry? She didn't hear what he said. Yeah. She heard how he said it and read into the emotions. And so I was reading into all of these things and thinking, okay, you say you're an agnostic and atheist, but you take life seriously. I don't think so. And so to your question about metaphysics, it wasn't that I was really scientific in my approach. It was more that there was a friend living down the hallway who said, you need to read about Edgar Cayce. Okay. So that was actually, because I told him, I shared with him, I'm on a search. I'm looking for truth and meaning. He said, well, you need to read about Edgar Cayce. And I did. Wow. And he's considered to be in that realm of metaphysics, they say. I don't even know. I didn't approach it scientifically, to put it that way. Yeah. But I was open. I was like a sponge. If you have something to give me, I want to hear it. I want to see it. I want to examine it. That same friend also introduced me to the Rosicrucians, which is a cult. Oh, wow. Occultic. And that was deeply disturbing. I began to see manifestations of supernatural phenomena, like waking up in the middle of the night and because I'm hearing furniture moving around and in the living room outside the bedroom and go out and see candles lit that I didn't light and weird stuff like that.
When you were reading about the occult?
Yes, I was going through the Rosicrucian step-by-step process of going deeper and deeper into their
So you were like inviting the evil spirits into wow.
Absolutely.
Okay. Wow.
Absolutely. And but by the same token, I had a conscience, right? A human, God-given conscience. And when I was about to utter this quote-unquote vow of the Rosicrucians, facing, I forget now if it was south or east or west, whatever, I had to face a certain direction and recite a vow, I saw, without turning around, this figure that was, I can only describe as reminiscent of something you might see on a pyramid, an Egyptian pyramid, with half man, half animal. Like it had the head of an animal in a human body. And it was standing right behind me, ready to just enter my being.
Wow.
When I completed the vow. At least that's what I discerned, I saw, quote unquote, saw, felt. I felt it so strongly that within 24 hours, I had boxed up all these Rosicrucian monographs and mailed them back to California where they have their headquarters.
Wow.
Because my conscience was warning me. The same thing with astral projection. I studied that, and I felt like I was about to leave my body, so to say.
Yeah.
But something again stopped me. And then as I continued working through these religions, it was the Eastern religions in particular that began to settle me a bit and show me some promise that, you know, at least I can have peace through meditation. I can, and I did. I experienced a certain amount of peace with that. But let me just jump ahead to the Christian part, because that happened in a very unique kind of unpredictable way, where I had gone to Australia to write a screenplay, to develop a short story, a true short story, into a script for a feature-length film. And the main character of that story was a Ukrainian immigrant to Australia. And the story made certain inferences to him having been a spiritual person who sang in public. Evidently, he sang a song of David in public, but it didn't go into any real depth as to his spiritual beliefs. But when I got to Australia and began interviewing people who had known him, because the story happened in the 1950s, and my trip there was in 1980.
Okay.
So time had passed.
Right.
And I spoke to people who had known him, and they said, oh, well, he was a very devout Christian. And because of that knowledge, I went out and bought a Bible for research.
Yeah.
I figured, well, if he was a devout Christian, and I knew enough to know that a Song of David would have been a psalm, so I needed to buy a Bible and, you know, at least read the Psalms, because I'll find maybe a psalm that he would have sung from Anzac Hill in Alice Springs, which is where the story happened largely. And I did that. I bought a Bible at a Christian Science reading room because I saw it advertised in the display window. There was a Bible, well, and it was cheap. So it was like $4 or $5. And that is what got me started.
Did you go straight to the Psalms? Is that?
I initially went straight to the Psalms.
Wow.
But then, you know, what happened was it was like a burning stick of dynamite in my hands, right? And you can kind of picture the devil or devils on either side say, okay, you've read the Psalms now. Close the book, close the book.
Research is done.
Research is over. And I said, well, this is interesting, because I had childhood memories too. I went to an Episcopalian grade school in Tampa.
Wow.
Yeah, I had thank God, my parents were very loving, and my mother especially wanted me to have a good education. Yeah. So she made sure that I went to this school, which was a private school, and they did teach religion. Yeah. So I did have some memories of religion, and even the Sermon on the Mount, but I had never read the Bible. But there I am, and I've gone through the Psalms. And you know, there's a book not too far away from there called Ecclesiastes. Yeah. And I've heard people say, now that I've been a Christian for years, ask, why is Ecclesiastes in the Bible? Doesn't it kind of make faith look bad? I mean, all this pessimism. And
life is meaningless.
Life is meaningless and vanity and a chasing after the wind. Well, I'm here to tell you that spoke to my heart. That spoke to my heart as an unbeliever, a seeker, and someone who had lived, excuse me, as someone who had lived, well, let's just say a colorful life in many respects. That spoke very much to my heart and my mind. And then, you know, there's another book, not too far from Ecclesiastes, called the Book of Job.
Yeah.
And you would wonder, well, why would that interest me? And I still don't know why it interested me, apart from the fact that when I read Job and when I had finished reading it, I could feel, discern as if God, though I wouldn't have called him God at that point, really, but I had this impression that as Job had suffered, I too would suffer. It was like a warning in a way. And it just, again, made me pause, made me think, where are these thoughts coming from? I was asking myself. And again, I am not an enemy of spirituality. This is an important point to remember. And it's especially important, I think, for Christians to remember, so that they don't become so judgmental toward others, people of other faiths, people who are searching, people who are asking questions. That's a good thing. And then I went over to the Sermon on the Mount. Oh, the devil was just having one nightmare after another.
Right.
And when I read the Sermon on the Mount, it absolutely, I want to say it transforms me. It certainly transfixes me in the moment of reading.
Right.
And I find myself saying, I think I probably said it out loud even, in that moment of reading. I was in Alice Springs, Australia, in a little motel room with a manual typewriter trying to write this screenplay, but reading the Bible. And I almost, if I recall, I said aloud, I found the truth.
Wow.
I was searching for truth, and I found it in Alice Springs, Australia. And that would have been in like December of 1980. I don't say the sinner's prayer. I have no idea what the sinner's prayer is. But I know that this man, Jesus, was different. He was just different.
Well, go ahead.
Just one last thought there is that I was reading the King James Version of the Bible, and there was one verse in particular that struck me. Never man spake like this man. And that also had me really, really thinking. Never man spake like this man. And I would have to say that even then, before I had accepted him into my heart, I had come to agree with that. Never man spake like this.
Right. Well, that was the C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien having their conversation before Lewis became a Christian, and I think Tolkien kind of was like, look, this guy's either telling the truth or he's a lunatic. In both scenarios, never man spake like this man, like either he's a lunatic and nobody's ever spoken like that, or he's telling the truth and nobody's ever spoken like that. It's interesting that you went, the imagery of the devil being like, oh my goodness, here we go. We're starting in Psalms and then Ecclesiastes and Job, and then you go to, but if you look at that, from the devil's perspective, if we wouldn't even go there, you start in the Psalms. The Psalms are beautiful. They're poems, there's poetry, it's artistic, and it's an interesting place to start. And not a lot of people I know became Christians and starting by reading the Psalms, because the Psalms, they're different from the rest. The poetry literature is a lot different from the narrative and the epistles and things like that. So you start with the beauty, and then you move into Ecclesiastes, which is a little bit more depressing. You're like, oh, okay, everything's meaningless. And then Job is like totally perplexing. I mean, theologians still don't fully understand what's going on in Job.
Excuse me.
No, you're good. In Job, because it's so, Satan goes to God and asks for permission to destroy Job's life, and then everybody dies, and then Job does it, and all of his friends say you're doing something wrong here, and Job's like, no, I don't think so. But then Job kind of questions God, and then God shows him all the stuff that Job's like, you don't know what's going on. I know what's going on. You don't even understand. And then you go to the Sermon on the Mount, which is like Jesus isn't necessarily nice in the Sermon on the Mount, So it's like, from Satan's perspective, maybe the whole time he was like, once he reads this, he's going to think this is all crazy. Because you go to all these places that people, even now, Christians today, Ecclesiastes, Job, Sermon on the Mount, they're some of the most difficult things to read in the Bible, and to accept it as truth. And you come to the end of it and you're like, this is truth. That's a miracle in a lot of ways, because I could see the opposite happening. Somebody reading all those things and being like, well, this started nice with the Psalms. Now you're ending with Jesus. saying things that nobody has ever said before and calling people out and, you know, like, blessed are the poor. Like, what do you mean blessed are the poor? You know, we want to be rich. It's interesting that you went in that direction. So, okay. Well, man, we could go in a lot of different directions. I do. So I want to talk about story, and maybe this connects to your testimony, because you come to find the Psalms through going to write a screenplay.
Yeah.
So so tell me a little bit about why you got involved in filmmaking, story writing, and what was it about story specifically that you think is so important? And then what was it about the medium of filmmaking rather than writing books, novels, or plays? What did you see about filmmaking that you thought, well, I want to go do that?
Yeah. When I was little, meaning in grade school, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, that age, I just loved reading novels. And we could call them the classics of literature, the Three Musketeers and the Count of Monte Cristo.
Oh, yeah.
In particular, those two I remember so well. How many leagues under the sea was it? 20,000?
20,
I can't remember. But the Jules Verne story. And here's, it's an interesting thought. It's kind of coming to me now for the first time, maybe, that when I would read these books, and sometimes they were the classics illustrated comic books, just to be clear, but I would also read the books themselves at a very young age. I read The Rime of the Ancient Mariner when I was 9 years old. Gave me nightmares. And I would picture what I would read, and perhaps that's common. Is that common for you when you read? Do you picture?
I'm watching a movie in my head. Yeah, that's what's happening.
So you understand.
Yeah.
And maybe that's more common than not.
I don't know.
That's what happened to me.
Yeah.
When I would read, I would just picture it. I was treating myself to a movie as well. And when I was,
Do you do that too? I always mix up nonfiction and fiction. Nonfiction is not real, right? No, nonfiction is which one? Which one?
Nonfiction is like a biography.
Yes. Okay. I always mix those up. I don't know why. Yeah. Do you do that with nonfiction as well? Where when you read through, like I read a lot of theology, and if I'm reading a book on theology, whatever, the Trinity or typology or something, I'm still seeing it like that, like as a movie in some ways. Are you that way, or?
Well, you need to become a filmmaker, I think.
I would love to. that's what I would love to do.
I tend more to, when I'm reading books like that you've described, I tend to kind
of fall asleep. Yeah.
But so anyway, when I was younger, like I began to think, really what I want to do when I grow up is become a writer.
Yeah.
A novelist.
Wow.
A novelist. Tell these stories, create stories. I also wanted to ride on the back of garbage trucks because I thought that looked really cool. And become the president of the United States.
Wow, yeah.
And pump gas at a filling station.
Wow.
So, I was like any kid. I had a lot of different ideas, but writing books was one of them. Yeah. I really thought this is what I want to be. And I initially thought I'd become a photojournalist as a career. And I made another trip to Australia prior to the one that we were talking about earlier, where I had taken a year off between high school and college.
Sure.
Specifically to travel around Australia, take pictures, keep a journal, and turn it into a book, eventually the journal, and go off to college as a photojournalist major. That was my plan.
Wow.
But when I did go to college, it was as an English literature major. And I went to Harvard, okay? I went to Harvard. That's where my undergraduate studies began.
Wow. And what years were those?
That was 71. I was the class of 70. I skipped the first year because I took AP exams. I was very strong in English, history, languages. So I was able to...
Wow. You skipped the first year.
I skipped
Harvard?
Yes.
All right. So I'm talking to a genius. That's what I'm hearing.
You're definitely not. Because I'll tell you. Well, you may be talking to an idiot savant. Is
Sure.
what you might be talking to. Because I may have very great strengths in some things and complete deficits in others.
Sure.
And while I was at Harvard, they had these film retrospectives in those Ivy League houses. They were built in the 1800s and have 20-foot high ceilings or whatever with bookshelves lined with books and big, beautiful easy chairs. And somebody would bring in a 16 millimeter projector on a Friday night, a Saturday night, and put up a poster out in the yard. And hey, we're going to show Potemkin tonight, or some Italian movie or French movie, Japanese. And I'd go to these screenings, and I'm seeing foreign films for the first time in my life.
Yeah.
And wow. It was like discovering that languages other than English are spoken in the world, And that did something to me, seeing these films from these other countries. It just influenced me deeply. And I took a little course there too at Harvard about basic filmmaking, and where they give you a Bell and Howell wind-up camera, and you have to come up with a story. And I just was in my element. I just discovered suddenly I'm as happy as a pig in the mud.
Yeah.
And in fact, I left Harvard because after that year, because they didn't really have a film program. And I had become really riveted on, this is what I want to do. I want to be a filmmaker.
Wow.
And so I went down to University of Texas at Austin, studied there for a year in radio, TV, and film, and then moved to New York, where I didn't go to college for a year. I worked. Then when I went back to college, I went to NYU, where I got my degree. And of course, NYU is one of those meccas of filmmaking. Right. It's like the East Coast version of USC Film School and all that, AFI, whatnot. And then, from that point on, it's been this marriage of story. Story is always first for me. And you hear, I think Clint Eastwood has said, story is king. I believe it was, what's Job's first name, the guy that started Apple?
Steve Jobs.
Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he said the most powerful people in the world. You would think it's me, but no, he didn't say that. He said the most powerful people in the world are those who tell stories.
I think that's absolutely true. Yeah. That's.
And I'm not coming at it from that perspective, just to be clear. I'm not interested in power. I'm really not. I'm not interested in wealth or fame or power. Nowadays, I make movies to win people to Christ, to win people to God, to influence them. Maybe not grab them by the neck to say the sinner's prayer,
right?
But to be an influence to them like different people were to me in my time, right?
That dynamic is interesting because the most powerful people, and I do think, right, there's a lot of different narratives and stories being told all the time by different people all over the world. And I think as we've developed kind of a research for the projects that we're working on with the Tales of the Kingdom animated series, I've watched a lot of stuff on George Lucas. Like, I love George Lucas. I love Star Wars. And he talks about, he was going to become an anthropology professor, I think, and was going to school studying anthropology. And he read this book on different civilizations and how they started. And it was, he realized, well, all civilizations are built on story. There's some sort of myth or story. And so he wanted to create a myth for our civilization and the space opera of Star Wars. And so that's what he did. But the interesting thing about the gospel, right, because the gospel is the good news, and it's a story, it's a true story, but it's a story that almost flips that dynamic on its head, the dynamic of we're going to tell the story for power. It's like, well, I don't, Jesus is from, the ghetto. I mean, really, he's not from a nice area. He doesn't ever gain political power. He goes and he does his ministry for 3 years. He spends 30 years nobody knows what is he doing for 30 years. And he does 3 years of ministry. And so that story of Christ flips everything on its head. It's like what ends up happening though, hundreds of years after Jesus dies or goes up to heaven, is you have kings and emperors who bow the knee to Christ because of the story of Jesus. And it's like the story trumps the person who's using other stories to gain power. It's like the true story is even more powerful than the most powerful person trying to manipulate story to get more power, is like a paradox of the Christian faith. And it's very interesting. That whole dynamic is really interesting, and it can the story can change people's lives. And so you've probably noticed that in your films. Tell me a little bit about a couple of the movies you've made. Pick whatever ones you want. And what sort of impact have you seen those those movies make on maybe people in America or people across the world? What's that been like?
My first films were made in Mexico and other countries of Latin America, but primarily Mexico. I speak Spanish as a second language. So that was never a barrier to me. The language barrier was never a barrier.
Yeah.
Or the culture. And I kind of dived right into producing there in Mexico. Once I settled on being a filmmaker to declare God's glory. See, I had been a filmmaker before I'd become a believer, right? As I've explained.
Right.
So when I did become a believer, I rejected filmmaking. I considered it as something impure, unclean, because my whole orientation had been,
wow,
I can't serve God with this. Depart, come out of it. It's unclean. It's unclean. And it was about, I want to say probably about a 2-year process that I went through before I began to feel that God was saying to me, it's okay. It's okay. You can be a filmmaker. In fact, it's my will for you. You know, it was a process. It wasn't a one-night epiphany. But through a process, I began to feel increasingly comfortable that I could return to filmmaking. So, as a Christian. So when I did return to filmmaking as a Christian, I made those first films in Mexico and Latin America. They were shorter format, the other countries. I was working with CBN, the Christian Broadcasting Network, International, CBN International, not right away. I made the films in Mexico independent of them. But at a certain point, I went to work with CBN International as a producer and just continued making films around the world. Wow. And my experiences have been very encouraging because I've actually met, talked, and interviewed people who, well, it was my film. They saw one of my films and it changed their life or changed the trajectory of their life. I remember one man, I should clarify, I didn't speak to him directly, but he was a drunkard. He didn't treat his wife well or his family well, but he liked movies. And so he went to see my first film, Ropa Nueva para Felipe, New Clothes for Felipe. And he just dissolved in tears, was broken, gave his life to Christ, as far as I know, is still serving God. In many such stories, I heard a story of a man who was about to commit, he had decided to take his life.
Wow.
A particular night, had a gun, he was going to shoot himself in the head. Next door to him was this church that was showing another film that I made. And they have, in Latin America, they like to turn the volume up really loud so everybody could hear. And he was hearing...
It's an evangelism technique.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So he's hearing this dialogue, which in effect was a story. You know, he's hearing the story and he's hearing the music and he gets curious. So he puts the gun away, so to say. You know, he doesn't do the deed, and he goes next door and sort of slips in the back, and the movie touches him, and he gives his life to Christ and doesn't kill himself. And there have been so many other stories of a similar nature all around the world. I've also made movies in South Africa, Mozambique, Nigeria, Turkey, Indonesia. Bosnia. One of my personal favorites is the movie we made in Bosnia and Herzegovina called Sabina K.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's the story of a, well, Bosnia, perhaps most people know, but if they don't, it's a largely secular kind of country. It's European in its orientation. And it's kind of divided between Muslims and Christians, though in Sarajevo it's more 90% Muslim.
Okay. Yeah.
And the story is set in Sarajevo. And this woman, she's not a devout Muslim, but that's just who she is. She's a Muslim. And she has eventually an experience with God through a vision when she tries to take her life. Because her life has gone so disastrously downhill. She ends up homeless. And
Did you write this?
well, it's based on a true story.
It is, okay.
So,
Wow.
so yes, I did write it. The person that it's about wrote it first. I asked her to write everything down in Bosnian. We'll translate it to English. She said, that's good. I want to do that because I've been wanting to write a book anyway. So she wrote her story down, and I got it translated into English. And you know what that was like for me? It was like having the wood or the marble that I could go to work on.
Yeah, right.
You know, like Michelangelo.
Chisel it and
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
I believe the story is that the statue of David was a piece of rejected marble that nobody wanted, nobody knew what to do with, but he saw something
Right.
there, and
That makes sense, right? It's like, come on,
Yeah.
that's David's story. He's the young brother that nobody wanted to fight Goliath, and somebody saw something there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
and she wasn't a famous person, but
Yeah.
I saw the story potential there, and I just like how it turned out. We worked with great actors in Bosnia, fantastic crew. Most of them were Muslim or atheist.
Wow. Yeah.
Remember, Bosnia was part of Yugoslavia, a communist country, so atheism was really propagated
Yeah.
for decades there and still affects many people.
Wow.
Very, very tiny Christian minority there. A couple of Christians were on the film. But we worked together just beautifully and made this lovely story. And that's, I mean, that's been shown on YouTube to hundreds of thousands of people, probably millions at this point. And just reading the comments, it just, most of them are from the region.
Yeah.
So I'll use Google Translate to
Yeah.
see what they're saying. And then recently I've made a movie called Let Me Have My Son. And that's very close to home because it tells the story of my firstborn child, Daniel, who developed schizophrenia in his teen years. When he was 16 or 17 years old, he began to show signs of mental illness. There was eventually diagnosed as schizoaffective disorder.
Wow.
But as the opening of the film says, perhaps it's more the story of his father. And in fact, I guess it is. If you watch the film, you realize that the story's being told through the eyes of the father, who's had to struggle with how to help his son and being frustrated, it seems, at every turn because of the mental illness. It's such an implacable foe. And, how do you fix it? How do you... Well, you don't, honestly. Well, you do fix it in a sense, but it's through love, really.
Yeah, it's like any other, corruption of the fall. It's like, do you fix that? Yeah, it's like, well, when Christ comes back, right? That's when it all goes, when all things are made new. But as of right now, you struggle with it. You fight that battle, and you do the best that you can with what you have. One of the things that you talked about a little bit was, you just talked about some of these stories, like somebody was going to kill themselves. You had a drunk. And it's like, I don't want to knock secular films because I think there's a lot of really good movies out there that are secular. I just mentioned Star Wars. I love Star Wars, but it does seem like the Christian filmmakers they're trying to accomplish a task that it's just not the same as a secular film. You're not trying to make billions of dollars so you can make your next 10 films. You're in some ways, I mean, you're trying to change people's lives eternally. There's an eternal impact to these stories that you're telling. That is like, okay, you spend $1 million or $2 million on a movie. To me, that's worth it if one person gets saved, right?
Yeah.
It's like God's not going to be like, man, you didn't invest that money well enough. It's going to be like, no, one guy got saved. This is worth $2 million, worth all the money in the world. So there's a deeper vision and goal for Christian filmmakers. Do you feel like, and I didn't tell you, I'm just thinking of this question right now. So do you feel like Christians have done a good job of taking that responsibility on and using the film medium to tell stories with the purpose and goal of not making a bunch of money necessarily, but of saving souls, getting people to know who Christ is?
I think that's a mixed report card, to be honest with you.
Right.
I think possibly in years gone by, that was more the motive. But I see myself, I see a very commercial slant to much of what we call Christian filmmaking.
Sure.
And I do see the profit motive being the driver for many more than anything else. And I mean, lip service may be paid to saving souls. I don't even think they say saving souls, frankly, but having an influence. And this is a very complex subject in a way, with many nuances and areas, shades of gray. I myself have evolved in some respects in terms of my approach to filmmaking.
Okay.
When I first set out as a filmmaker, it was only about saving souls. And let me clarify what I'm saying. I still believe it's really only about saving souls.
Yeah.
But where I have changed over time is, well, how do you actually accomplish that?
Yeah.
How do you
Sure.
bring people to know Christ through a film?
Yeah.
And that's where I have evolved over time, because yes, someone can get saved by finding a tract on the sidewalk and reading it. That does happen. But more often than not, it doesn't, because the tract is just too simplistic. Or like the guy that wears the sandwich board, repent.
Yeah.
You know?
The kingdom of heaven is near.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that may have an impact. I don't deny that it can have an impact.
Right.
Please don't misunderstand. But I have come to believe that film is an art form. And like any other art form, it has to be afforded respect and delicacy and sensitivity. And people are not stupid. If they feel you're trying to shove a message down their gullet, they're gonna seal their lips shut, sew them up. Let me out of here.
Right.
You know, they're not going to be receptive.
Because it's the wrong medium. I mean, you go to church.
It's the wrong medium.
Yeah, you go to church and it's like,
Or a street preacher.
Yeah,
a street
right,
preacher
right.
has to be direct.
Exactly.
And he should be direct.
Right.
That's how you work on the street.
And
right?
there's nothing wrong with that. That's good.
Nothing
People
wrong
get
with
saved
that.
through preaching, but they also
Absolutely.
get saved through Christ preaches to, probably 15, 20,000 people in the Sermon on the Mount, right? 5,000 men, kids, and everybody. Okay, he preaches.
Yeah.
And then in some scenarios, he goes and he tells us a parable. And you're like, okay, there's two different mediums that he's using to accomplish the same type of thing. Right. But what ends up happening, right, I agree with you. Those two things start to convolute each other in some ways. And then the preachy thing gets thrown into the film, and you're like, okay, what is this a movie? Is this a story? Or are we giving a sermon? Or what's going on here? And people get confused. And then they leave, and they don't want to see anymore. So that's that's interesting.
And people like to contemplate art.
Yeah.
You know, they want to think about it. They don't want to be told what to think. They don't want to be led to the water and forced to drink. Leave room for God to work at the end of the day.
Sure.
You be true to yourself. You be true to the Spirit. Do your work with excellence and every bit of creativity you can muster.
Yeah.
But let God do the leading. You know?
Always been one of my minor frustrations with preachers, pastors, is they give applications at the end of sermons. I don't like applications. And I'd say some people love applications. Give me the 3 applications. I don't like them because you get 500 people sitting in the pews or whatever, coming from 500 different backgrounds, places in life.
500 different mornings. That morning. What
Yeah,
happened that
right,
morning?
Right. One person got up and drove, and the other person tried to get their 3 kids in the van. It's like everybody's coming from different places. And the Word of God is infinite. It's not infinite in length, but it's infinite in impact in the same way that the cross is. And the application could be different for 2 people from the same scripture. It doesn't mean it can be anti what the scripture actually says. I think the scripture means what it says, but I think the application, if it's a passage on forgiveness and I listen to it, I'm like, oh my goodness, I am thinking of the exact person that I need to talk to because I need to forgive them. And you might be thinking, oh my goodness, I'm thinking of the exact person, and they're different people.
Sure.
Those are 2 different applications. And I think that it seems to be speaking to kind of what you're saying about story is if you do this as well as you possibly can and you be creative and you leave people room to think about what's actually happening, the applications can be infinite. You didn't know that there was going to be a guy with a gun next to a church that was playing. You didn't know that.
No.
You just made a good movie, and then they heard it, and you're like, okay, let God do what He wants with this thing, and that's I mean, in my opinion, that's the best approach to anything Christian. I think you do as well as you possibly can, but you don't try to corner people, and you just say, look, man, this is the truth, and what are you going to do with that? So,
And another, I guess I'll have to use the word complaint I have about contemporary Christian filmmaking. I'm not convinced they're really trying to reach an audience outside the church.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And so how is that conducive to winning souls? You're preaching to the choir.
Yeah, right.
Are you reconverting the converted here?
Right.
What, huh?
Yeah.
So I know what God put in my heart from very early on. I had a missionary heart, a missionary zeal, and I'm still interested in preaching, communicating to people who don't yet know the Lord, just like a missionary would be. A missionary's not going to go to the church. He's going to go outside, right? And I don't see that. I don't see that nearly enough among today's Christian filmmakers.
Which is so sad because it's been proven in just so clearly in the 20th century with the Chronicles of Narnia and the Lord of the Rings.
Exactly.
What you can do if you don't just write for the church. I mean, they just wrote children's books for children, and hundreds of millions of people have seen. They're classic. Those books will go down as classics. Everybody knows Narnia.
Yeah.
All my friends growing up who were not Christians, they know Narnia and Lord of the Rings. Yeah.
I got to tell you a quick little story on that note.
Yeah.
Maybe 2, but Paralandra. I had no idea at the time that it's part of a space trilogy.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm an unsaved guy somewhere in my 20s. Can't tell you what airport it was, but I walk into the bookstore at an airport and I look for a book to read. And I said, this looks interesting. Paralandra.
Wow.
And I read Paralandra on the airplane. Do I become a Christian immediately? No, but there was something different about that book.
Yeah.
And it never left me.
Wow.
In a way. It was just like a little seed, I guess you could say.
And that's the second
one. It
one.
was planted there.
Yeah.
I didn't know.
Wow.
I didn't know, but it was something there. And with Chronicles of Narnia, I had become a Christian when I first, I think I watched the cartoon version with my kids. But when I saw how Aslan was shorn of his mane and tied down on the altar, and these demonic creatures, or the ghouls,
Yeah.
and then the little mice come along and gnaw away the ropes. The story of Jesus was right there.
It's so
in
clear.
parable form. You
Yeah.
know? And wow, that's how I think that's how we reach people.
You
Most profoundly.
Right. I think that they're tapping into some subconscious imagination that people didn't even recognize they had. This like deep yearning, especially my generation. My generation has been so deprived of good story and of truth in a lot of ways that there's something deep inside a lot of them. And I think Christians have an opportunity right now where, things are bad. Like, things in my generation aren't great. You have high suicide rates. There's kids are totally lost and they don't know what they're doing with their life. And depression, anxiety, all the mental health stuff. But to me, that's like the harvest is plenty. Like people who are hurt and need help, like that's where you want to be as a Christian.
Exactly.
It's like Jesus said, I came for the sick, not the healthy. So we've got a bunch of sick people in America right now. So we have the perfect opportunity. And sometimes you like shake your head because the church is
asleep.
Yeah, they can't figure this out. It's like you've got a wide open opportunity right now to totally change the course of history for a lot of people, and doesn't seem like we're taking advantage of that.
Yes, I totally agree. And you have to use, in my view, there has to be an artistry about how to do that.
Right.
You can't just be didactic. It's not just getting a bullhorn and saying the 4 spiritual laws or whatever, and move on to the next. You have to woo people. We have to be winsome.
That's what Lewis says. You have to sneak past the watchful dogs of earlyhood childhood association or whatever, because there's all of these, whether that's earlyhood Christian association for a lot of people who have left the church, they don't want to hear the Christian stuff. So you have to sneak past those watchful dogs and tell them a story you're still incorporating those truths, but they don't even know it. And then they're like, oh, this all clicks. Yeah. You have to, I don't want to use the word sneaky because you don't have to be sneaky. I think you can be forthright. This is the truth, but you have to do it in a way that's beautiful and that taps into the imagination. And I think that this is a little weird, but when my wife and I were getting married, we went in to marriage counseling with the premarital counseling with the pastor. And he was like, he had to talk about sex. And he was like, look, God created sex, right? And Christians have the closest relationship with God. So Christians should be the best at sex, right? And we were like, well, I guess that makes sense. And I was like, well, I think you can apply that to everything. Like God created story. He created art. And it's like, why aren't the Christians should be the best at it? Because we've got the best insight into what's actually happening in reality that we can actually pull from and the truth that we can pull from to create story. And in my lifetime, which is short, it has felt like Christians have dropped the ball on a lot of the artistic side of things. We've made a lot of movies and a lot of art and film and TV that has not done as much impact as what the world has done. The world is totally, they've done a great job pushing their message, and we've done a terrible job pushing ours. Real quick, we have a couple minutes left. I want to talk a little bit about the next generation. So I'm like the next generation. I'm 24. And as you get older and as film progresses and moves forward into different styles and things like that, what do you want to see for the next generation of filmmakers, screenwriters, specifically in the Christian category, but maybe even generally and overall? What would you like to see?
I'd like to see a more classical approach on the part of younger filmmakers to the craft. It's as if, and no offense intended, but people your age, they have one film typically, a defining film, Star Wars, or maybe Raiders of the Lost Ark. And that's why I want to be a filmmaker kind of approach. And it's like you want to be a writer and you've only read Grapes of Wrath. Let's say you haven't read any other books. And Grapes of Wrath is a great book. And you can be, you can learn a lot from it and so forth and so on. But there's a lot more material out there that I think it would behoove you, if you're a young aspiring filmmaker, to explore, to study, to examine, just as you would if you were to go to art school. Right? You would study the classics.
So you want to see more students of the craft?
Yes. Yes, that would be my call.
Sure. I mean, that makes sense. When I was doing an interview with a couple guys who are Lewis experts, and they were like, people will say, I want to be the next C.S. Lewis. And they're kind of like, well, you're going to have to do 30, 40 years of intensive study on medieval literature and like different languages. Like if you want to be the next C.S. Lewis, you got to do what they did. You can't just pick up a pen and start writing and pretend like you're going to actually make the next Lord of the Rings. It's like, no, you have to be a student of what they were a student of. And I think a lot of people my age, we're the age of instant gratification. We think we can pick up a camera, pick up a piece of paper and a pen, and we're going to write a brilliant, genius thing. The reality is the first 100, 200, 300 things you write is going to be horrible. And you just have to keep trying and keep reading. And so I'll give you a story that kind of aligns with what you were saying. I started a theology podcast like 5 or 6 years ago. It was my first podcast. I was 19. I was just trying to find answers, talking with my pastor on the podcast, you know, all the questions that young Christians have. Can you lose your salvation? What is the Trinity? All these things. And if I go back and listen to those, which I don't usually because I sound like an idiot now, but I'm like, I've learned so much by being a student of theology, but I had to learn in the beginning. The first thing I had to learn, which is very important, is I have no idea what I'm talking about. I am like very dumb when it comes to theology, but I wanted to know. I wanted to know more about God. I wanted to know who he was, what is going on here, what is the church, what am I doing? And in that search and study, I had to ask a lot of questions that people would think were dumb questions, and I had to read a lot of books. And it's like now over the last 5 years, I think I've come a long way. I know a lot more about God, and my relationship with God has been strengthened through it, but it just was a lot of trial and error in a way. You just learn. You're just like, okay, I'm going to ask this question. I'm going to figure out what.
No shortcuts, right?
Right. No shortcuts.
Do the walking.
Right. Yeah. I couldn't know about God without him revealing himself to me through me seeking it out. And I think that's a lot of the similarities with any sort of craft or anything that you want to know better. You have to actually search for it. Yeah. So yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't want to. I guess we got to end here because it's time. But so, any encouragement to the next generation before we go?
Yeah. They say youth is wasted on the young, but when you're old, you can't do as much as you can when you're young. So try to just have a balanced approach on life and rejoice. I think it's Ecclesiastes. Well, somewhere there in the Bible. Maybe Lamentations, I can't remember. But rejoice in your youth. Rejoice in your youth. It's for a season. It won't last, but rejoice in your youth and use your strength. Not just to do, but to study, to prepare, to make your dream known, make it clear, make the vision plain while you can, while you're young. And just approach each day with vigor, with enthusiasm, and just never give up on your goals.
Great. That's awesome. Well, Chris, thanks for doing this. We gotta do it again and talk longer and more about all your different movies. I have a million other questions, but I really do appreciate you doing this and taking time to be here. So thanks so much.
Sure. It's a pleasure.